listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to the second part of the briefing's two-part special looking into the chaos that's erupted over content creators in the Australian political sphere. Social media stars say they've been unfairly hung out to dry in recent weeks, and those throwing accusations of bias should look in the mirror, make room for the new media, or move over. But while media is no doubt evolving, there's a counter-argument that journalism matters when it comes to covering politics. One person who's been covering this story and cast a critical eye is Jenna Clarke, Associate Editor at The Australian. She joins me now. Jenna, welcome to the briefing. Do you think the media frenzy and criticism of influencers and content creators has been justified?
Hasn't it been interesting? Everyone's got their cottontails certainly in a twist in Canberra, and the legacy media, as we've learned from the Trump administration, how they like to call us. Look, I think in some instances it is, and I think everyone from Media Watch right through to us at the National Broadsheet have covered every aspect of how influencers were allowed into the budget lockup and will be joining either the opposition leader Peter Dutton or Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on the campaign trail. And I think it's really interesting because I think this is where we're really, really seeing such a stark generational divide and a generation gap, because interestingly, come May 3, this will be the first poll in Australian history where millennials and Gen Z will outnumber baby boomers for the first time ever. So it actually makes a lot of sense for the MPs, people wanting to win seats, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, he's done it as well, wanting to engage with online opinion makers, because that's where the eyeballs of that younger generation predominantly are.
Is the issue and the criticism, do you think, around both the content creators and the politicians, or one or the other?
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think as we've seen this week where, the Australian Electoral Commission has cast a review into one of the interviews that the Prime Minister has done on a podcast, and as well as the Greens leader as well, just to see whether it could be considered potentially to be promotional material as opposed to an interview. That has been really interesting, and the AEC have decided that the line was drawn and it was just an interview. Politics is incredibly hard to decipher. It's harder to decipher than Adrian from maths, because especially when you're looking at things like budget papers, policy, procedural process in the House and the Senate, it's very tricky. That's why a lot of the great political journalists in this country have been in Canberra for more than 20 years, and they understand the machinations, how it plays and things like that. So I think we need to find this beautiful Venn diagram where we have to have politically astute and capable influencers actually being able to hold to account the politicians and really, hold their feet to the fire when it comes to grilling them on things like policy that will affect them, like health, education and climate.
Is it the content creators' role, though, to be holding the politicians to account? I understand the reasoning for it. Can there not be a difference between what the content creators offer as opposed to traditional media?
That is really interesting, Tara, and I think that that's probably where the conversation will go. But I think the problem is the majority of young people, as we've seen in numerous studies for the past couple of years, are only really consuming their news from social media. They're not really reading the newspaper. They're not clicking online and subscribing to a lot of the legacy media outlets, which, regardless of, everyone has a bias, and it probably an unconscious bias when they're creating content online. And the problem could be the fact that that's probably not declared. Although you must say some of the content creators that have done really well in this country, such as Hannah Ferguson and Abby Chatfield, they are really, they don't hide what their political afflictions are. So it's really up to the people that consume it. Also, if you think you're not getting the information that you need, seek it out elsewhere. Everyone's got some news for you.
Do you see any parallels between, say, when these politicians are on both sides of the spectrum sitting down with podcasters or content creators to sitting down with, say, media that critics would say are particularly friendly to certain sides of politics?
That's some of the criticism from the online content creators are saying, well, legacy media sometimes have bias towards one side of politics, so why are you shocked that we do? I think the difference is that the online content creators are They potentially don't even declare their bias. And then the problem also is, even if you don't follow specific creators, but you've engaged with some type of, hashtag #Ozpol content, that can find its way to you via an algorithm. And if that's the first time that you're engaging with it, you may actually take that as Bible and think that what they're saying and what politicians are saying to them, it could be fact. And sure, I'm not saying that things are not factual, but it's always good to stress test anything you hear from a politician. And that's why I'm hoping, and I think we have some great online content creators that were in the budget lockup and will go on to be wonderful political commentators moving forward. It'll just be, I think we're just now at sort of ground zero, and it's going to be great to see them transform and morph as they become more aware of how the game in Canberra is played.
Playing devil's advocate here, content creators have shared some criticism, like you mentioned, in return. And you mentioned that one of the issues with their content is when they aren't forthright with that bias or being transparent. How is that any different to if we aren't, as the media, as traditional media, upfront about that as well? Like you mentioned, I think it can be agreed that there is bias within traditional media. It's been long thrown around as an accusation. How is it not hypocritical?
I think the difference is when you look at traditional media, and I'm coming from a place of, say, newspapers or an online news service, the majority of newspapers have things called editorials. So I would always urge anyone that is encouraging to read a publication, the first thing you should do is go to that editorial page, because you're going to get a pretty quick idea of where that publication lands, not only on politics, but specific issues, because they can also swing on where they land on something. So don't be so sure that everyone is just right and just left. I think that's the beauty of Australia. We've got such a vast landscape, and I think we've got pretty good bullshit detectors. So I think people, regardless of their age, regardless of their background, or regardless of whether they like to engage with legacy media or not, you can pretty much pick who's pulling your leg or not. But I would just, encourage anyone that wants to learn about traditional media bias or a slant, read the editorial from a newspaper or an online news service, and sign up to things like electronic digital media from the traditional media outlets. They'll normally send out letters from the editor and things like that. So you get a really quick idea about where things are leaning pretty quickly.
And what about in terms of us as journalists and the different mastheads? We're meant to be, unlike content creators, bound by these certain guidelines and media and ethics around not being biased in our reporting, and yet we still see it. Do you think the criticism calling for such boundaries around what the content creators can do is fair, given that?
I think the difference with traditional media reporting is that there should be a clear delineation between what is just straight news reporting and what is opinion and comment. And if they are not, labelled in bright neon lights that there are different things, then that's a real issue with traditional media. And I think that's the problem with online creators, is because they probably don't know how to delineate between their personal point of view, because again, that's their brand, right? So I think people are going to them because they want to hear their point of view on something. So I think moving forward, we're not going to be calling them influencers. And I think that that's quite derogatory, because I think what they do is a lot more meaty and will offer a lot more to the discourse in this country moving forward. They're opinion makers. And I think you follow those people because you like their opinions.
Okay, and that's interesting. It brings me to my next question, because you did write a piece in The Australian yourself. The headline states that why Anthony Albanese is cozying up to influencers, so using that term yourself. The first line states, self-obsessed, desperate for popularity, calculated. Firstly, to clarify, are we talking about the PM here or the creators?
We're talking about both to an extent. Everyone's got a little bit to an extent, me included, right? So I think it's been really fascinating. And I think it just goes to show that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, he's a very skilled politician and political animal. And he has been playing in the social media shadows for about a year now. He's really been courting influencers, courting the online space, which is incredibly clever. And it turns out that maybe having influencers, let's call them new media personalities, invited and in some cases, the ALP paid for the accommodation and travel costs for some influencers, not all, just some. It actually has paid off for the government because, as we saw in News Poll, which was one of our political polls that we published in The Australian, we were asking questions about the budget. And the 18 to 24-year-old cohort said 27% of those polled said, yeah, I think that I'm going to be better off under this budget over the next 12 months. On the flip side, older Australians, so that's anywhere from 45 through to 65 plus, 10% of them were the only ones that said that this will make me better off. Overwhelmingly, they said that they would feel worse off with the budget. So not saying that it's having influences, the budget has swayed opinion that much, but it is interesting to see how the news and how that information from budget was disseminated on the night and how that has now played out in the general public.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the AEC investigation into the collaborative posts between Abby Chatfield, the Prime Minister, and the Greens leader. Now, the AEC had said that there is room for content creators to cover politics under news and opinion, yet there's still some corners of the media and politicians that are questioning it and criticising it. Why do you think that is?
It is interesting that Senator Jane Hume from the Coalition raised it in Senate estimates. And I think a lot of people have misconstrued this by she was just trying to be a troublemaker. But I think she was raising a really interesting point of view because it's not like these new media creators are going away. We have to learn to work with them and we have to learn to bring them into the fold to educate them about the institutions that we're trying to operate within. So when you see, Abby attending events with the Greens, wearing Greens merch, talking about Adam Bandt, how much she loves him and stuff like that, I think it is interesting that they've cast an eye over it and we now have an answer. But I think the age-old adage is, if in doubt, authorise. So that's kind of where they should have had the Greens team overlook it and say, this is written and authorised by XYZ. So then you actually know that it is political content in the thrust of an election campaign.
But does it not then make it appear to be more like advertising that was kind of coordinated by the Greens, that they've got editorial control or might have paid for it, which it was not?
Yeah, that's where I think we have to really thrash out what the barometers look like for moving forward in terms of political content and online. I think this is one of the tiny conversations that we have to have around policing online content, and it should definitely be front of mind when we come out of this election campaign, as well as things like bullying and stuff like that.
We've talked about Hannah and Abby and some of the different content creators that have been part of this conversation. And I interviewed Hannah a little bit earlier on this topic myself. And she had made a point that she felt like the kind of traditional media needs to move with the times, and that if they don't, that they'll die. What do you think?
Oh, look, I think that's her criticism, and that's I think what Hannah is doing is she's doing an incredible job, and I think just watching her sort of flourish in the role of new media executive is incredible to watch. I think there's room for everybody, and I think for her to say that legacy media will die, I think is wrong. I think there's going to be place for a lot of voices, and I think that's what we need. Otherwise, we're all going to exist in echo chambers. A contest of ideas happens when, people of different political persuasions or political opinion or ideas come together and thrash it out. So I think there's room for everybody, but I think it's also beholden to people that want to seek out different ideas and engage in information and debate. Seek out news, because I swear it's out there.
Jenna, thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing.
Thanks so much, Tara.
That was Jenna Clarke, Associate Editor at The Australian, speaking with me there in part 2 of this 2-part special on content creators in politics. If you haven't heard part 1, that's in your feeds right now, and there's a link to it in the show notes as well. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone who you think might find it interesting, or you could share our social posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.
Listener.